Keir Starmer thought he had everything under control. Then Richard Tice dropped a political bomb. And now Labour is falling apart. Real migrant buses are arriving in Labour strongholds. Councils are in chaos. Voters are furious. And Starmer, he's panicking on live TV, completely trapped. The worst part, it's all 100% legal. This may be the moment that changes British politics forever. Richard Tice didn't issue a warning. He launched a missile. Without a whisper to the press or the opposition, Reform UK began rolling out what may be the most disruptive immigration strategy in modern British politics. Migrants formerly housed in overburdened working-class towns like Dover and Rotherham are now being transported directly into Labour and Lib Dem councils, areas that once proudly chanted "refugees welcome," but never had to live with the actual consequences. Tice wasn't bluffing. This wasn't a symbolic stunt. Reform councils are invoking local authority rights, rejecting new asylum housing contracts, and physically relocating illegal migrants into opposition territories. And the impact has been seismic. Lincolnshire was the first to move. Within days of taking local control, Reform leaders shut down asylum hotel plans and restructured council operations to block migrant accommodations. Behind closed doors, legal teams moved fast, shredding contracts, sending cease and desist letters to the Home Office, and preparing convoys of buses. These buses didn't head toward traditional holding towns. No, they drove straight into the heart of Labour territory, delivering a political payload so explosive it sent Starmer's inner circle into meltdown. Panic exploded across Labour offices. Constituents in upper middle-class districts, once vocal champions of open borders, started flooding inboxes with fury. Local councillors were blindsided, not consulted, not prepared. Angry town hall meetings erupted overnight. Questions flew. Why here? Why now? And why weren't we told? The very voters who supported Labour's open border policies were suddenly living through their consequences, and they didn't like it. The double standard that Reform UK has long accused Labour of, preaching compassion while outsourcing the cost, was now on full display. Richard Tice didn't just talk about hypocrisy, he dragged it into the daylight and shoved it into Starmer's backyard. The timing couldn't have been more brutal. With a general election looming and Labour trying to present itself as the grown-up alternative to the Tories, Reform's strike couldn't be ignored. Mainstream media tried to spin it, to downplay it, but the footage was everywhere. Buses, angry residents, councillors on the defensive. The chaos was real, the consequences unavoidable. And Keir Starmer, he cracked. When cornered by reporters, he lashed out, calling Reform dangerous, inhumane, and reckless. But his words fell flat. No passion, no solutions, just panic. Voters saw the fear behind the script, and more importantly, they saw something else. Reform was doing something neither Labour nor the Tories ever dared, enforcing consequences for failed immigration policies. Reform didn't stop with one council. A blueprint was already in motion. Dozens of other Reform-led councils were reviewing similar policies, preparing legal challenges, gathering intel on Labour and Lib Dem districts that had historically voted for open border policies. A digital map circulated internally, colour-coded zones showing exactly where migrants would be redirected. The message, you supported mass migration, now you deal with it. Tice himself appeared calm, almost surgical in his delivery. "We've had enough," he said in an interview that's now gone viral. "If they want open borders, they can live with the result. We're done dumping migrants into communities that never voted for it." There was no shouting, no fire and brimstone, just cold, brutal strategy. And the reaction, massive. Reform UK's support exploded online. Social media lit up with clips, commentary, and cheers from long-neglected towns. Volunteers started organising, legal experts offered pro bono support, and even former Tory voters began openly endorsing Reform's boldness. What was once seen as a fringe protest party had become a political insurgency, one with legal teeth, growing grassroots power, and a strategy tailor-made to expose Labour's soft underbelly. Inside Westminster, the ripple effects hit like an earthquake. Lib Dems scrambled to distance themselves, issuing bland statements about due process and fair housing, but it was too late. Footage of migrants being offloaded into Lib Dem districts was already circulating. Residents were asking uncomfortable questions, local leaders had no answers, and the Conservatives, frozen. Rishi Sunak's government stood helpless, watching Reform do everything they once promised but never delivered. Tory MPs began whispering about defections, about alliances, about how Reform had stolen the law and order narrative from right under their noses. But at the centre of the storm was Keir Starmer, the man who promised to bring decency back to politics, now reduced to damage control. Every move he made, every speech, every interview was drowned out by the one brutal reality. Richard Tice had beat him to the punch, and worse, he had used Labour's own words, their own policies against them. The fallout from Reform UK's first wave was swift, brutal, and unrelenting. As migrant buses pulled into Labour and Lib Dem strongholds, the illusion of moral high ground shattered almost instantly. What once felt like distant statistics on immigration, safely tucked away in working-class towns, was now knocking on the doors of quiet suburban Labour neighbourhoods. The same people who marched for refugee rights, shared "no human is illegal" posts, and backed Starmer's immigration rhetoric were now staring at asylum centres being set up near their children's schools, and just like that, their compassion vanished. What took years to build, Labour's image as the party of empathy, collapsed under the pressure of proximity. Starmer, caught in a trap he didn't see coming, had no off-ramp. If he condemned Reform's actions, he would look like a hypocrite. If he supported the redistribution of migrants, he'd face an internal rebellion. So he did what all cornered politicians do. He stalled, issued vague statements, and hoped the headlines would change. But they didn't. Instead, the headlines got worse. Every day brought a new front-page crisis. In Oxford, a Labour-led council exploded into infighting after receiving 2 busloads of asylum seekers with no prior notice. In Brighton, Lib Dem councillors accused Reform of political terrorism, even as their own constituents demanded answers about housing, crime, and school capacity. And in places like Cambridge and Lewis, long known as bastions of progressive thought, public sentiment turned volatile. Town halls were filled with fury. Parents, retirees, and lifelong Labour voters lined up to ask the same simple question: why didn't you prepare us for this? But the truth was, Labour never believed they would have to. Their immigration policies were always written with distance in mind, designed to sound noble in Parliament, not to function in real communities. And Richard Tice knew it. That was the entire point. Reform's trap wasn't just legal, it was psychological. For decades, the burden of mass migration fell disproportionately on the working class. Towns like Doncaster, Hull, and Oldham were forced to absorb the social and economic strain while being lectured by politicians who lived in gated communities and leafy districts untouched by reality. Reform didn't just shift bodies, they shifted the entire conversation. Now Labour had to face their own policies head-on, and for the first time they had no buffer, no spin, and no scapegoat. Starmer, once the polished barrister with a calm demeanour and carefully crafted soundbites, started to show visible cracks. His press appearances became defensive, his interviews tense. One moment stood out above the rest. During a Sky News segment, he was asked point-blank whether the Labour councils would continue accepting migrants redirected by Reform. He dodged once, twice, and on the third attempt snapped, calling the policy vile and a betrayal of British values. But by then, it was too late. The damage was done, and his anger only proved Tice's point. Behind the scenes, Labour HQ was descending into chaos. Leaks began spilling out from senior advisors who described the internal mood as apocalyptic. Starmer was reportedly furious, not just at Reform, but at his own team for failing to anticipate the fallout. Strategy meetings turned into blame games. Backbench MPs warned that safe Labour seats were no longer safe. Councillors threatened resignations, and in one now infamous meeting, a party official warned, "If we don't get control of this, we're going to lose the Red Wall all over again, this time for good." And while Starmer scrambled to contain the internal collapse, Reform UK only pushed harder. Their legal teams, emboldened by early victories in Lincolnshire, began expanding their campaign. Freedom of information requests were filed to identify which Labour councils had previously signed contracts for asylum accommodations. That data was then weaponised, publicised, targeted, and used to justify further relocations. Councils that once quietly supported open border policies were now under siege, both administratively and politically. Every move was calculated. Reform didn't need to win the entire country. They just needed to break the illusion that Labour's immigration policy was workable, moral or fair, and they were succeeding. Meanwhile, in the Conservative camp, silence. Rishi Sunak and his cabinet remained paralysed. Reform's strategy exposed not only Labour's flaws but the Tories' cowardice. For years, they made promises: border control, deportation flights, ending the hotel racket, but never followed through. Tice's aggressive, unapologetic actions made them look weak. Tory MPs, desperate to avoid losing more ground, began openly praising Reform's tactics in private. A few even hinted at switching parties, or at the very least forming alliances in future local elections. It was no longer just a political fight, it was a full-blown rebellion against the status quo. Reform UK, once dismissed as a protest vote, was now a growing force of reckoning, rallying angry voters and disillusioned politicians under one simple message: if you voted for this, you own it. What made this even more devastating was the public response. Reform wasn't just pushing policy, they were galvanizing a movement. Communities that had been ignored for years began organizing. Grassroots groups popped up overnight, offering legal aid to reform councils, coordinating voter registration drives, and flooding local radio shows with support. In some towns, reform candidates reported tenfold increases in new member applications. The mainstream media tried to discredit the movement, calling it racist, dangerous, extremist, but the attacks didn't stick. Voters were tired of being shamed for asking questions, tired of being ignored, tired of being the ones who paid the price for elite policies, and now they had a political vehicle with teeth. Starmer's nightmare was no longer theoretical, it was unfolding in real time. Every attempt to regain control failed. Each press release looked more desperate. Polling began to shift. In areas where reform redirected migrants, local support surged. Starmer's team tried to pivot, talking about fairer systems, community consultation, and balanced policies. But nobody was listening. Reform had already rewritten the rules. The public wasn't asking for more consultation. They were asking why the same politicians who invited migrants into the country didn't want them in their own neighborhoods. The silence was deafening, and looming over it all like a storm cloud on the horizon was Nigel Farage. Still silent, still off camera, but everyone knew what his silence meant. He was watching, waiting, and preparing. Richard Tice may have lit the fuse, but Farage was the explosion yet to come. What began as a bold move in Lincolnshire had now snowballed into a nationwide political reckoning. Reform UK was no longer reacting, they were leading. One by one, more reform-controlled councils began executing identical strategies, rejecting asylum hotel contracts, evicting existing migrant accommodations, and rerouting new arrivals directly into Labour and Lib Dem areas. The buses kept moving, the pressure kept mounting, and Keir Starmer, he was running out of options. Inside his own party, loyalty was disintegrating. Councillors in key constituencies were refusing to cooperate. Local MPs were begging party leadership to put a stop to Reform's tactics, but Starmer had no jurisdiction over council authority. Reform UK had found the legal gaps, weaponised local power, and used it with deadly precision. What looked like chaos from the outside was in fact a carefully orchestrated political war plan, and Labour was losing badly. By the time reform buses began pulling into places like Oxford, Cambridge, and parts of Greater Manchester, the message was clear. This wasn't a stunt, it was a revolution. The shock on the faces of Liberal Democrat councillors when dozens of migrants arrived without warning said it all. In one local meeting in Surrey, a Lib Dem official was filmed shouting at Reform's legal team, accusing them of sabotage. The clip went viral, but not for the reasons the Liberal Democrats hoped. The public saw a politician, clearly rattled, unable to reconcile their own open border ideology with the real-world effects. The clip's top comment summed it up perfectly. You voted for this, now live with it. Reform UK wasn't slowing down. Richard Tice doubled down in a follow-up press briefing, standing next to legal documents, council orders, and maps showing future target areas. This is what action looks like, he said. The people who voted for mass immigration are now being given the chance to practice what they preach. No more dumping, no more lies. This is the new standard, and we're just getting started. His calm, firm tone cut deeper than any shouting match. It wasn't just the content of his words, it was the sheer confidence, the clarity, and the unapologetic energy that made the establishment look outdated and powerless. Back in Westminster, Starmer's team began to crack under the pressure. Confidential leaks revealed that Labour's internal polling had taken a nosedive in key red wall constituencies. Areas once considered safe Labour were now leaning toward reform by double digits. Some party strategists pleaded with Starmer to pivot, craft new messaging, propose restrictions, or at least show a firmer stance on migrant housing. But Starmer was stuck. To harden his position meant alienating his progressive base. To remain soft meant hemorrhaging working-class votes. The Labour leader, once hailed as the pragmatic steady hand to replace Tory incompetence, now looked indecisive and cornered. Every move Reform made tightened the noose around him. Meanwhile, Reform councils began issuing public bulletins detailing how Labour-controlled authorities had previously approved migrant accommodation deals without public input. These records, meeting minutes, emails, planning permissions, were now being blasted across social media. The outrage spread like wildfire. Voters realised they had been excluded from decisions that directly impacted their lives. Trust broke instantly. One tweet from a Reform supporter in Blackpool gained over 1 million views overnight. Funny how it's only wrong when they show up in your neighbourhood. Reform is just evening the scales. The comments flooded in, angry, supportive, energised. This wasn't just a battle about migrants anymore. It had become a symbolic war between two Britons. The forgotten working-class towns who bore the brunt of globalist policies and the progressive elites who wrote those policies from their comfortable distance. And for the first time in decades, the working class had a party that wasn't just speaking for them, but acting for them. Reform's messaging was simple, sharp, and brutally effective. No more safe zones for hypocrites. Local Labour MPs began cancelling public appearances. Protests erupted outside town halls. In one shocking incident, a Labour councillor was booed out of a community meeting by his own voters for refusing to condemn the new migrant allocations. The betrayal felt personal. The communities that had long stood by Labour through economic downturns, through Brexit confusion, through party infighting now felt abandoned and deceived. Reform was there to catch them. At the same time, Reform's internal machine grew sharper and more aggressive. New candidates were being trained, legal teams expanded, and private funding surged. Anonymous business donors, once tied to the Tories, began funneling money into Reform campaign coffers. Behind the scenes, Nigel Farage was making calls, reaching out to influential media allies, retired MPs, and political strategists. Though silent in public, his fingerprints were beginning to show. Everything pointed toward one inevitable moment, a full-scale national campaign. And this time, it wasn't just about protest, it was about power. The Conservative Party, now barely holding its base, was watching its right flank collapse. Rishi Sunak's muted responses and vague condemnations did little to reassure voters. In fact, every time he spoke about balanced immigration, Reform supporters gained thousands more followers online. Tory MPs, desperate not to lose their seats, started unofficially adopting parts of the Reform strategy. One member of Parliament in Essex publicly supported migrant relocations to Liberal Democrat areas, calling it a necessary rebalancing. It was a desperate move, and voters saw through it. Reform wasn't just setting the narrative, they were dictating the battlefield, and still, the media couldn't keep up. For every attempt by The Guardian, the BBC, or Channel 4 to label Reform as extremist or inhumane, Reform fired back with hard legal documentation, council testimonies, and videos of real residents supporting their efforts. The public didn't care about labels anymore. They cared about results, they cared about who was doing something, and Richard Tice was doing something. Every night the news showed new footage, buses arriving in Labour towns, residents confronting councillors, Reform press conferences laying out new targets. Every headline was another cut into Labour's credibility. The emotional toll was massive. Voters weren't just angry, they felt betrayed. They were promised compassion, unity, and transparency. What they got was virtue signalling from a distance and silence when reality hit home. And now, with Reform UK scaling their operations and Labour on the defensive, the country found itself at a political breaking point. The old rules were gone, the old parties were bleeding, and the new force forged in frustration and sharpened by strategy was rising fast. The political landscape of Britain is shifting faster than anyone could have predicted. What started as a local protest against the strain of illegal migration has erupted into a national firestorm. And at the centre of it all stands Richard Tice and Reform UK reshaping the rules with every passing day. Keir Starmer, once poised to lead Labour into a confident general election campaign, now finds himself surrounded on all fronts, publicly embarrassed, internally fractured, and strategically outplayed. His worst nightmare wasn't losing to the Tories, it was being exposed by a party he thought was a sideshow. Across the country, Labour councils are still scrambling to cope with the fallout. Legal challenges are mounting, crisis meetings are being held behind closed doors, and voter trust is disintegrating in real time. Councillors who once proudly stood on refugee platforms are now facing voter uprisings they never anticipated. And the worst part, Reform UK isn't breaking the law. They're using it masterfully, relentlessly, and without apology. That's what makes it so devastating. They've cornered their opponents without firing a single illegal shot. Every council decision, every redirection, every contract termination, it's all by the book. Which means neither Starmer nor the Lib Dems can stop it. They can only suffer it. As more reform candidates prepare to enter the political ring, the message is crystal clear. The days of detached, elite-driven policymaking are over. Reform UK has exposed the rot. Policy decisions made in posh Westminster offices with no regard for the people on the ground, and voters have noticed. What we're witnessing isn't just a political shift, it's a realignment. For the first time in decades, ordinary people feel heard, not with empty promises or flowery speeches, but with action, and that's what's causing panic in the establishment. Behind the scenes, the silence of Nigel Farage is becoming louder by the day. His return feels inevitable, and when he does step forward, be it as leader, strategist, or kingmaker, the shockwaves will only grow because what Richard Tice has done is lay the foundation. But Farage, he's the one who knows how to burn it all down and build something new. The timing is meticulous, the momentum is undeniable, and the public appetite for disruption has never been stronger. Keir Starmer can no longer hide behind vague statements or polished talking points. The crisis is no longer on TV, it's at his doorstep. The refugee slogans, the media soundbites, the backroom policies, they've all crumbled under the weight of real consequences. And Reform UK is standing in the rubble, stronger than ever, pointing to the wreckage and saying, "We told you so." So here we are witnessing the most aggressive political shake-up in modern British history. A movement once mocked as fringe has now forced the two largest parties in the country into crisis. Labour is crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. The Conservatives are paralysed by their own cowardice. And Reform UK, they're marching forward louder, sharper, and more focused than ever before. The big question now isn't whether Reform will keep growing, it's how far they'll go. Will they remain a disruptor, or will they become the dominant force reshaping Britain's future? And now we ask you, do you think Keir Starmer can survive this storm, or has Richard Tice just redrawn the political map for good? Let us know what you think in the comments below, because one thing is clear,